All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started this afternoon on our webinar presentation, Historic Resources Survey, the who, what, when, why, and where of understanding historic resources. We're really excited that you could join us this afternoon, and we hope this will be a really interesting and engaging learning experience for all of you. My name is Mallory Bauer, and I have the privilege of serving as the field representative for the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, so welcome. Slide. All right, so Zoom is the software we're using today. Many of you will be familiar with this software, but I just want to take a brief moment to just orient you to how to ask questions and how to participate so you can get the most out of your experience today. So first of all, if you have a question, please feel free to type that into the Q&A box whenever you think about it. We will be pausing as questions come in if needed, and then we will take some time at the end to also answer any questions that come up. So if you are looking at your screen and you're seeing the presentation, but no Q&A box, just wiggle your mouse a little bit and there should be like a bar that comes up that should have Q&A listed. Click on that and type in your question and we'll be happy to answer that for you. The chat window will contain some links to resources if they come up that we feel like you need immediately and we want to share with you. We will also be compiling a one-pager with some helpful links and resources that will be sent in the follow-up email along with a link to the recording of this webinar. We are going to pause for polls in just a moment because we want to know a little bit about you as audience members, why you're participating today, what your background is, and a couple of other questions. So please participate in those polls and make sure you hit the submit button, because if you just click but you don't hit submit, it doesn't count your participation. So that's a little tidbit. Again, this webinar is being recorded and we will send a link to everybody who attended and anybody who was unable to attend live. And that will live on our MHPN YouTube channel. So if you're interested in any of the recordings from our past webinars, do check that out as well. And thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy your webinar. Slide. All right, so again, we're talking about Historic Resources Survey today, and slide. So the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, we are your statewide nonprofit that advocates for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We are a membership organization. If you are interested in becoming a member and helping us fulfill our mission, please visit us at www.mhpn.org today and become a member. Additionally, our annual conference has gone virtual and registration is also open for that. So you can find more information about our conference on our website as well. So I hope you'll take a moment this afternoon to check out all the things that we have going on outside of the webinars today. Again, that is www.mhpn.org. Okay. Slide. And these webinar series have been supported by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. Great organization, and we very much appreciate their support. So we're gonna do some of these polls. So I'm gonna launch a few questions, and our first one is, what is your preservation role? And I think I have it set up correctly where you can select several different options if you feel like you serve a couple different roles in your preservation in your community. Again, don't forget to hit the submit button if you want to be counted. We'll leave this open for just a few more seconds. Panelists, if you want to participate too. All right, I think we're holding pretty steady at those numbers, so I am going to share those results with you. We have quite a few municipality staff. We have some consultants, study committee members, historic district commissioners. Great, a good representation of a lot of different people. It's great. So our next question is, have you worked on a historic resource survey before? So Yes, no, maybe, not sure. Maybe the other option would be possibly a long time ago. All right, so that was a pretty easy one. So I think I'm going to close this one and share this. So we have, it's about split between yes and no, and one maybe, unsure. What they did in the past was a survey, which is hopefully we'll clarify that a bit today. All right, and the next question is, does your local government have a person on staff who works on preservation activities? So yes, no, you're not sure if your community has a preservation person. All right, this was another pretty quick one. All right, so a nice, that's great to see so many people from communities who have someone who is in staff who can help with preservation activities. That's great. All right, and one last poll before I turn it over. And do you know, how does your community select areas for historic resource survey? So is this a plan process, part of your master plan? Do you survey areas where there's possibly development pressure? Is it spearheaded by your local residents who are interested in a certain area? You're not sure, or you're not sure if your community has ever engaged in historic resource survey. All right, so not as many people are participating. We'll give it just a little bit longer. All right, so I think most people who have been participating have been counted. And so I'll share those results. So some are, part of a master plan. One, we have development pressures, and then, but the majority is, not sure how areas are selected, or the community has not conducted a historic resource survey yet. So, all right, well, thank you so much for participating in those polls. That's interesting information for myself and my SHPO colleagues to understand who is with us today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Katie Kolakithis from the State Historic Preservation Office.
Get myself unmuted. Good morning. As Mallory said, my name is Katie Kolakithis. I'm the survey coordinator with the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office. For those of you that don't know, we're the state agency tasked with working on preservation projects in Michigan. So we have a huge variety of programs. You've probably, if you've participated in other webinars, you've seen other colleagues of mine do presentations on some of our program areas. I think we have about 12 different program areas. So we do a lot of different kinds of work around Michigan. So I will get started. So survey at its most basic is the process for identifying and gathering information on a community's resources. Survey should serve as the baseline for most designation and identification projects. I'm kind of in an interesting position in our office in that my program area touches almost nearly every single other program area. So it's been I've been with SHPO for about 3 years, a little over 3 years, and it's been a very interesting experience to get to work with so many different program areas. But a thorough, well-done survey can inform National Register nominations, local historic district study committee reports, and other designation projects by informing communities about its eligible resources, which can also then help with redevelopment efforts by identifying projects that may qualify for historic tax credits. So there's a lot of different types of survey. We'll go over some of them today, but I wanted to cover first the difference between an archaeological survey and an above ground architectural survey. Our office has an archaeologist, one right this second in our office, and she's in charge of reviewing archaeological surveys. So that is not something that I do, that is her role. So we are going to be today primarily talking about above ground architectural survey. because there are different, there's different standards between the two different fields. So things are handled a little bit differently. So if you're interested in archaeological survey, let us know. Stacy would be happy to talk with you, and archaeological surveys can be a really great way for a community to better understand its archaeological resources. So the first thing we're going to cover, and hopefully this isn't review for a lot of you, is the different levels of survey. Primarily, we're going to talk about intensive level survey and reconnaissance level survey. There are others. Some people like to conduct windshield surveys and some other kind of not a little less intensive surveys where they literally just go out and drive. But we're going to be talking about kind of the more primarily used survey forms today. So who should be doing survey? In my opinion, everyone. Of course, I'm not biased at all, but survey is a really great resource for a community to be able to understand the built environment in their community. We all recognize the value that historic buildings have to a community, and knowing what a community has and the current condition of those buildings can influence economic development opportunities, community interest projects, grant opportunities, especially CLG grants, and much, much more. So we see that surveys come from a huge range of audiences, as we saw from the range of audience members on this presentation. We, as an office, we see surveys come from local communities on their own. We see them from historic district commissions, graduate student projects, local historic societies, federal compliance projects through something called the Section 106 process, which comes through our office. And then even as a SHPO, we apply for and seek out grants to conduct survey sometimes as well. A little later in the webinar, Amy Arnold from our office will discuss some changes to the local historic district process in relation to survey. So we'll get that in a little bit. So there are two main kinds of survey, as I talked about, reconnaissance survey and intensive level survey. Reconnaissance level survey is primarily an inventory of properties. We're looking at National Register criteria, which we'll cover in a second, but we're only looking at one single criteria for this, for a reconnaissance level survey. We're also doing something called integrity assessments. We'll also cover that in a minute too. We're identifying sites that may qualify or warrant intensive level survey. And then we're also doing a historic narrative and historic context of the survey area, so that we're getting a good idea of what the survey area looks like and its history. And then, but we're not really, in reconnaissance level survey, you're not doing a deep dive into individual properties. On intensive level, on the other side, we are doing individual property histories. So we're looking at all of the National Register for Historic Places criteria. We're also looking at integrity again, and then we are writing a historical narrative and context of the survey area and each individual building, site, or resource. That also generally includes a recommendation for future work. So this is kind of a basic explanation of the difference. But this National Register criteria that I talked about, the National Register program uses 4 different criteria for evaluating historic buildings, and survey also uses the same criteria. So we are looking at whether things are associated with important events. We're looking at whether they're associated with the lives of past people, whether they embody a distinctive architectural style. So the kind of way that we talk about this is events, people, and then architecture. And then D is the last criteria, and that is the likelihood to yield potential information. And that's the criteria that's generally used for archaeological sites, that they have the potential to yield important information. The National Register also has criteria considerations. If you've been around preservation at all, you know that the 50-year mark is kind of our general benchmark for something to potentially be significant, but the National Register allows for things that are less than 50 years old to meet the criteria consideration for that particular thing. There also is considerations for religious buildings, let's see what else, graves, birthplaces, cemeteries, things that wouldn't traditionally be considered eligible just based on the structures that the National Park Service has created. But these considerations give us a little more leeway in determining that these may be eligible if they have exceptional significance. And then the National Register also has a series of really, really helpful bulletins that help to describe these. Mallory and I will add these to the links to these bulletins to the list of links that she'll send out after the event. This is just a snapshot out of one of them, but they're really, really helpful. They walk you through the National Register forms. They walk you through what we're talking about in terms of integrity, the criteria, all of those things. So they're a great read if this is the first time you've ever looked at anything like this. So when I'm talking about integrity, this is often confused with the condition of the property. And for us in an architectural survey, that's two different things. We're looking at the physical condition of the property is important. We need to know that, but we're also looking at the 7 aspects of historical integrity that's defined by the National Park Service. Those are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So in order to be eligible for the National Register, a property needs to retain at least some of its integrity. So it needs to maintain at least one, if not more than one of these categories. So for example, a house in a historic district that has vinyl siding and vinyl windows, which we often see, but the massing is the same, the location is the same, they did a fairly good job. They didn't just cover up all of the details surrounding the windows. We may still look at it and say, okay, you know, we can see enough of the original fabric of the house, either, or not the fabric, because that would imply materials, but original scale and size of the house that we can go with that one being contributing. But we want to have, just because you're missing one doesn't mean you're automatically out. So just keep that in mind as you're assessing integrity. But physical condition of a property is something different, and we do look for that, and that is important, and that can be really useful for a municipality to include in their survey when they're doing this. They can go through, a lot of times we see a municipality partner with their assessing department to do assessment checks for properties, and kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, and get out and see each of the properties and collect information for a historic survey as well as for the assessor's department. So and I have no problem with that. Whatever is going to make it the most useful for a community is what we want to have happen. So where do you start when you want to conduct a historic resource survey? First step would be to call us. We are happy to sit down, and generally in non-COVID times, I travel to communities across the state to talk to people about historic resource surveys. The first thing that you want to decide is whether you think that your community has the ability to tackle this on their own, or whether they're going to want to hire a federally qualified architectural historian to conduct the survey. So some communities have a fairly good depth of folks on their, for example, on their historic district commission that have history degrees and other degrees that may help them understand how to talk about and write some of these things and research some of these things. And some communities won't have that. So that's kind of the first step. But talking to us, and I'm happy to do, since we are all working from home right now, but since we've been working from home, I've done a couple of Zoom meetings with different communities to talk them through different aspects of their surveys that they're working on. So I'm happy to do that. Reach out, and my email is at the back of the presentation as well. So that's kind of my recommendation, so that you don't get so far down a certain road and have to kind of backtrack to meet the guidelines that our office has for survey. So that's kind of the first step. But if you think that you have the ability to take on a survey, then these 4 steps are kind of the basic steps for how you want to do things. And in terms of when each of these happen, we can talk a little more later as we get towards the research and report writing, but a lot of that will depend on the timing of your project, when you start, what the conditions outside are, because we all know Michigan weather can be a little unpredictable. And there are certain times of the year where it is better to survey, to actually physically do the field work. So as you can see in this picture on here, there's no leaves on the trees, there's no snow. So those are the kinds of things that we want to take into account. So that can change up how, like, when you do your research versus when you do your field work. And I don't have a problem with that. A lot of preservation professionals will have a preference and kind of their own personal, they like to do this first and then this. I think whatever fits your timeline is probably the right answer, but we'll get there in a little bit as well. We'll talk a little more about that. So to do your preliminary research, and you're really going to want to first develop a methodology. The survey methodology is as important as the survey itself. We need to figure out what the purpose of the survey is, what the community wants to accomplish. A community survey will have a very different methodology than a survey that's driven by a compliance project, for example. The boundaries on a compliance project will be predetermined and set based on the proposed project, which can be fairly limiting for those of us that may want to see a broader survey of, say, a historic district, but the project is only going through one road, and they've figured out that the potential area of what could be impacted is not the entire historic district. So that can really impact what the methodology is going to be. A community survey may want to survey a whole entire neighborhood, the whole city. Sometimes we also see thematic surveys of one specific building type. Jennifer Reinhardt from the City of Detroit is going to talk about a specific example of that a little bit later. But for community surveys, what we want you to do is to think about the outcomes that you would like for your surveys, and then work backwards to think about what are the best and most efficient ways that we can accomplish this. And again, we're happy as an office to sit down and discuss this with you. The next thing to figure out is what to survey. Some communities will survey every single building so that they don't have to go back out and survey again, because surveys do have a shelf life. If you go out tomorrow and survey everything that's 50 years old and older, next year you've got 1 year of property built or property that's not covered in your survey. So we generally recommend that if you don't have the capacity to survey everything, or you don't want to survey everything, to at least survey things that are 40 years or older. So then your survey has a shelf life of about 10 years, and it's not out of date the next year. But so that's kind of the first thing, is what you want to actually survey. You also have to figure out the boundaries of your survey area. And like we said, that will totally depend on the purpose of the project. So for example, the city of Kalamazoo right now is working on a really ambitious project to survey their entire city, every single building in the entire city, which is an incredible undertaking. And we're looking forward to continue to work with them on this. But and then there's other communities like in Grand Rapids, where they survey a single neighborhood every year or two and develop a survey report for that given smaller neighborhood. There is no right answer. So it's just a matter of figuring out what you all need and then scaling that down to what you can accomplish. In terms of when to survey, like we talked about, survey is best done in the spring and fall. Summer and winter are hard, unless you can happen to catch some of our non-snowy winter days. So that there's kind of a sweet spot where there's no leaves and there's no snow, where you need to try to get the best photographs. And we're going to go over photographs in a few minutes, because they can be one of the most challenging parts of conducting a survey, because they're also one of the most important parts. So, okay, so field work is kind of the next thing we're going to talk about. So survey notes, field inventory forms. We have a field inventory form. I have a picture of it that I will show you in a minute. There's also some folks will use apps and electronic survey methods. We'll talk about that a little more. And then these are kind of the topics that we're going to cover. So survey notes, things to note while you're out there. Want to talk about trees and vegetation. We want to talk about roadways, traffic patterns, sidewalks, light poles, fences. We're looking at kind of the whole entire scope of that built environment. So don't forget to take general notes about your survey area. And those can be just as important when you're describing your survey area as the individual properties within the area. Okay, So field inventory forms. Like I said, we have one. This is a photo of part of it, and it gives you an idea of the type of information that we're getting, that we're looking for. So we want information about the building materials. We want the plan. We want whether there are outbuildings. We're looking at kind of all of these different types of information. And we talked about the integrity. We talked about condition and some of the other things. But some people also prefer just taking notes on a piece of paper, and that's fine too. There's no requirement or anything to turn this particular field note form in. It's a personal preference thing, and I'm comfortable with whatever makes it easier for you. I personally find the field note or the inventory forms easiest for me because I don't forget something as I'm out there. But you would make one of these for each property that you're surveying, so it can be a little paper heavy. So in terms of our electronic survey forms, there are a number of them out there, and I only listed one or two. A lot of consulting firms in Michigan are starting to use some of these. We, as a SHPO, do not have our own just yet. There are SHPOs that have developed their own survey apps. We do not yet have that. We're in the middle of a, I hesitate to say multi-decade, but I think that's probably accurate at this point, project to improve our data in-house. And we are working on a GIS, Geographic Information System based database that we're hoping at some point we will be able to develop our own survey app that would feed right into that. When that will happen, I don't know. It's kind of a pipe dream for Diane Toonstra and myself in our office. So, but I don't have a problem with anybody using an electronic survey form or even creating a Google spreadsheet or whatever will work, as long as the information can be extracted into either an Excel spreadsheet or something similar, and then we make sure that the information collected is all of the information that we need to put things into our database. So that's unfortunately where we're at right this second. I wish I had better answers on that one right this second. So survey or photographs. Photographs seem like it would be the easy part, but I am constantly amazed at the photographs, in a bad way, about the photographs that we get, mostly from our compliance projects. But it's really difficult to take a good photo until you kind of know what you're doing and know what you're looking for and know how to do it. And then it's really hard to take a bad photo. All of the photos that we're going to see in a minute are ones that myself and a coworker went out and took, and it took us like 3 hours to take 15 bad photos because we kept taking good ones on accident. So some of the things to watch out for. Clarity is a major issue. People will move the camera, or they'll be driving in their car as they're taking the picture, and we get a lot of really blurry photographs. So be really careful about that. If you can't use a tripod or something like that, or be walking and stay completely still, using a fast shutter speed, if you're using that kind of camera, can also help. We do accept smartphone photos as long as they meet our minimum photo requirements. And those are, we can send you a link to the document that talks about that as well. The other issue that we have a lot of the time is composition. We generally want a 3/4 view of the building to show as much as possible. So kind of like an angled view of the front and at least one of the sides if possible. This produces, folks will often take a lot more survey photos than end up on the form. So everyone gets really confused why there's only one picture on the form, or one box for the picture on the form. But in reality, you probably should be taking photos of every side that you can see of every building. That way, if there's questions about the building, or if there's questions about the architectural style, we have more views of the building to see. So the photographs are the only way, when I'm reviewing a survey, photographs are the only way I can see these buildings. I can't drive out to every single property that we're looking at to try to see all the sides. So having good photographs is really, really important. The most common question I get is what to do with those additional photos that we take. I generally recommend that you add 2 photos to a single sheet of paper, just very simply, and make sure you include the address and either attach it to or include it with the survey form for each property, or have a separate photograph section in your report. Just so that, but we need to be able to match up the houses to either the address, historic name, however they're identified on the forms. Another big issue we have is lighting quality and direction of photos. As you can see from the photo on the left, the sun is directly in that photo, and you lose a lot of the details of that that you may see if the sun wasn't right there, kind of blinding you. When I did my very first survey, I don't even know how many years ago now, our former National Register coordinator had recommended to me to go out and photograph one side of the street in this historic district in the morning and one side of the street in the afternoon, and don't try to do them both at the same time. So a lot of times this can be a kind of an all-day effort to try to get good photos so that you can wait till the sun moves, and it helps to highlight details on the building. Let's see. Another big problem that we have is perspective distortion. An otherwise well thought out photo can be ruined by this, and it kind of looks like the building's tipping over backwards. And this can be really difficult in big cities where the city streets may be small and you can't back up far enough, or there are other buildings in the way to be able to take a photograph on an even plane. Sometimes this is not going to be possible, and we totally understand that. We are just asking people to make their best effort to try to get as great of a photo as they can that shows the building without it falling over backwards if possible. Some people use telephoto lenses. Sometimes folks will use wide angle lenses. We caution people to just be careful with that and be aware that sometimes that can cause other distortion problems. We also, sometimes if it's possible to get on the roof of another building across the street, sometimes that can help take photographs of the building across the street. So sometimes folks will stand on a truck, on a ladder, something else to try to elevate them up a little bit to get a better photograph. Other photography tips. Try as best as you can to avoid signs, cars, people, trees, poles in the foreground. It can be really difficult when if you're surveying a commercial downtown, where every single day on a day when there's enough light to take a photo, that there's cars parked like in the photo on the bottom. It can be really challenging. We just ask people to do their best to try to make sure that we can see as much of the building as possible. But like I said, we do also understand that sometimes it's just not physically possible, like the photo with the pine tree in it. That tree's never going to lose its needles, so it's never going to, that house is never going to be more clearly viewed than it is right now. But you can move to the side and change the angles up and try to get as good of a picture as you can. Use your imagination to try to get the best photo that you can. Another really common issue that I see, especially with modern architecture or large, long, sprawling buildings, involves the framing of the photograph. We talked a little bit about this before, but this seems to be a particular problem, so I'm going to mention this specifically. It seems to be a particular problem with modern schools. They often are set back on a big grassy field, and they are a very long building. So to get the whole building, you have to stand way, way, way back from the building. But then the photograph ends up being 2 inches of grass, an inch wide building, and then the sky. And it's really, really difficult for us to see anything with that building. So occasionally it is necessary to edit the photos a little bit to try to remove some of that grass and other distractions from the foreground. But just do your best, like we said. So this should be common sense, but just don't trespass. Please stay in the public right of way. If you don't have property owner permission, don't go on their property. We generally recommend asking, if you are not working on behalf of a municipality, we generally recommend notifying the municipality, the property owners, and or the local police, so that if the police get calls, they know that you're out there doing a historic resource survey. People will call, and so it also potentially helps to have a letter on you from whoever has hired you or whoever has kind of sponsored the survey if you're a volunteer. So if the Historic District Commission has asked you to go out and do this, it will be useful to have a letter from the Historic District Commission explaining what the thing is or what the project is, and then you can hand it to the property owners if they come out and question you about what you're doing. I fairly regularly get questioned when I'm walking around taking photographs of people's houses. So it is very useful to have that, or a business card or something that identifies you, because people don't like it when you take photographs of their houses. We also recommend holding public meetings and informing the community about what's going on and what's happening. Obviously, in the age of COVID, that's a little bit different, but finding ways to engage with the community can also really help make a more well-rounded survey, in my opinion, because most folks that live in historic homes are really proud of their homes, and they know things about their home that you're never going to find anywhere else, or they may have plans, or they may have photographs that you would never find unless you talk to those property owners. So don't be afraid to talk to property owners and to hold public meetings and conduct in-person interactions when that's all allowed again. And like I said, please don't trespass. Also be really careful about walking in the road. We all joke fairly regularly as a staff that we need some sort of bumper sticker on our cars about like, we'll stop for historic buildings. Because we often are stopping in the middle of the road to, oh, I need to take a picture of that real quick. So just be real careful about walking in the road to try to get that great picture. We certainly don't want anyone to get hit by a car. So your field work's done, archival work and library research. Like I said, there is no set schedule for when this has to happen. If your project kicks off in July and you want to get moving on something, but you know that you can't take your survey photos until October, November, there's nothing that says that you can't go do all of your archival and library research on the survey area or on the individual properties now. You may have to go back and do more research after you complete your field work. It kind of depends on how things play out, but there is no set schedule. It's, like I said, it's kind of a personal preference thing. I do think that if you do at least some of your research ahead of time, it can give you an idea of things to look for when you're doing your survey fieldwork, things that you may not have, they may have missed without knowing what you know after you do research about the area. So be aware of that. Libraries, archives, local historic societies are all sources of information on a community history and should be consulted during the project. Some surveyors prefer to do their archival research before. Let's see what else. County histories, historic maps, and newspapers should also all be consulted, but with eyes wide open, as they contain information from one particular perspective, that of the author. So particularly when you're working on projects that involve a underrepresented community, we often encourage the use of oral histories. Sometimes census research is necessary. I would say rarely deeds research is necessary in order to learn as much about a property as you can. I don't generally recommend a lot of deeds research because it's kind of a rabbit hole that it's really easy to get lost in deeds research because it's very complicated and it's very time consuming. And it doesn't always have a very high, it can have a high rate of return for what you learn, but it doesn't always. Reconnaissance level surveys, most of that in terms of individual properties is when we're talking about intensive level survey. Reconnaissance level surveys should utilize any commonly known history about a property if anything's becomes apparent while you're doing your other research. But it does not, like we said earlier, it does not involve a deep dive into each individual property. So after you get all your field work done and all your research done, it's time to write your report. And this can be challenging for folks. One of the biggest things that we see that is challenging is knowing and understanding the difference between a historic narrative about the history of a property and then understanding what the historic context is. And the context is one of the most important parts of the survey. According to the National Park Service, historic context means information about the period, the place, the events that created, influenced, or formed the backdrop to the historic resource. That often means that you have to conduct research on a larger area than just the survey area. So for example, say you are looking at a neighborhood in your city and you're only looking at this one neighborhood, your research cannot be limited to just that neighborhood. You have to look at the larger, what was going on in the larger city, maybe even the region, to figure out why did this neighborhood develop when and where it did and how it did. You have to expand your research to be able to establish that. You can't just look at everything in a vacuum. In an intensive level survey, each property should discuss the history of the community as it relates to the history of the individual property. So intensive level surveys are a lot of work. And the thing I think I want to emphasize again is that this is not a recitation of the history, but an examination of what was going on in the area that led up to the development of that resource. When we get reports in, the most common critique that I have of them, if I'm reviewing them for some purpose, is that there is not enough historic context, that they just gave me a narrative that's a recitation of the history. So places where you can find information about historic contexts are in the National Register bulletins. There are a couple different bulletins that have information about how to write and research a historic context. Historic contexts in terms of each survey are going to be different. Sometimes you'll need to write a context about the architectural context of why one particular architectural style became popular in a community. Things like commercial development, there's a lot of different topics that they can be on. But that is really a incredibly important part of your research and report writing. I'm not going to go super far down into the rabbit hole of the reports and the forms specifically, because we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. And I hope most of you join us on August 20th. But I'll mention briefly that we do have 3 different forms that we use for each individual property. These are used for reconnaissance and intensive level surveys. The only thing that changes is the amount of information that you put on them. So we have an architectural properties form that is for buildings, structures, objects. And then we have a form that's for historic districts and complexes, which would be like a farmstead complex with multiple buildings, or a historic district in a downtown. The way that these forms are designed to work is that if you have a historic district, you would fill out one district form for the whole district, and then you would fill out individual architectural property forms for each resource. So if you have a farmstead, same sort of thing, you would fill out one complex form and then one architectural properties form for each building. So each barn, corn crib, chicken coop, all of those things, so that we know what each building on the complex looks like. And then the last thing that we have is a cultural landscapes form that is used for cultural landscapes like parks and cemeteries and designed gardens and that sort of thing. So these are all available on our website already, and there are instructions for filling them out. We have been, for about a year now, we have been working on helping the whole office use these forms kind of as a baseline for the information that we collect for different program areas. So you may see these forms popping up in National Register or Section 106 consultation forms, because we're trying to kind of consolidate what we're using and make everything similar. So the survey report itself, it's going to depend, what it looks like is going to depend on the purpose. And as I mentioned before, we do want to make it functional for everyone. So if your community wants to include that assessing information that we talked about earlier, it doesn't bother me at all to skip over that part that I don't need to read, to be able to have it be useful to your community. I also think that one of the other mistakes that gets made with surveys is that folks are hesitant to use photographs and maps and graphics and historic photographs and maps. throughout the text. They'll put them all at the back or have a separate section for them. We want these reports to not just sit on a shelf in our office. We want them to be useful to a community. We want them to be interesting and have all the information that we need, but also be interesting and be useful. So I really think that that's an important part that often gets missed. So trying to figure out how to incorporate that is pretty important. So like I said, we are going to go a little bit more into the details of how to fill out the forms. We're going to talk about mapping and some of our mapping requirements how to make your project meet our GIS standards that we're working on. We're also going to talk about hiring a cultural resource consultant and a whole bunch more. So please join us on August 20th, and I'll be here to help in any way that I can, talking about the specifics of the forms and the reports. So that's all I have, Mallory. I don't know if we have questions for me.
Yeah, we just had a question come in. In your office, do you have forms for actual buildings that are well done? So survey reports for actual communities that are satisfactory. It's useful to see how others have done it and done it right. So do you have examples of communities who have done this well?
So we are working on pre-COVID. Our certified local government coordinator has undertaken a couple of survey projects in certified local government communities that were going to serve or are still going to serve as examples. We hesitate to put, most of our projects are done by consultants that were hired either by us or by someone else. And so we hesitate to put or to kind of single out one consultant. And so because we obviously as a state agency, we can't show favoritism or anything like that. So the hope was that Alan Higgins, our CLG coordinators, projects, because they're done by a staff member, will be able to be posted on the website. And that is still the plan. Things got a little interrupted with COVID because he hasn't been able to go out and do the field work. But we talked about it a couple weeks ago, and I'm hopeful that by probably maybe mid next year that we'll have an example of, I don't remember if they're reconnaissance or if they're intensive level surveys offhand, for 2 communities that he's doing surveys for. So I don't have, like, the way that my job works is that I'm primarily reviewing surveys, not doing them. So it's a little tricky. We do have other surveys on our website, and Amy will have to tell us, I can't remember if the Detroit Civil Rights Project survey is up on the website yet, but that's another one that will be up there shortly. So there are a few, and we hope to get more, is the not so short answer on that one.
All right, excellent. We did have another quick question come in, and then we'll dive into Amy's presentation. We will have time, keep those questions coming. We will have time at the end to discuss them, but quickly, how much time should be typically allocated to the documentation of one average property? So not intensive. So kind of to give an idea of planning and scaling the effort and the expectations for a project.
It depends on if you're talking intensive level survey. It depends. There's no easy answer for this because it's going to depend on what is available. Like for example, I did at the time it was only a National Register nomination, but it was essentially the same amount of work as an intensive level survey, but in the city of Hart, Michigan, over on the west side of the state. And there were about 65 buildings or so in that district, and probably 3/4 of them I actually was able to identify construction dates, original owners, original tenants, all of this. But there are just going to be some buildings that you can't find any information on. That's just kind of the way that it is. So it really is going to depend on each individual property and how much information is available. Say, for example, properties in the city of Detroit that have Sanborn fire insurance maps. You're going to get a lot more information on that particular property and have a lot more starting point for like where to look in newspapers than you would in a community that doesn't have those maps. There's no easy answer for that. In terms of reconnaissance level survey, it should take you 10 or 15 minutes to stand outside the property, take all your notes, take your picture, and move on. It's pretty quick. In terms of the physical research, like I said, you're not doing, for reconnaissance, you're not doing individual property research. So it's primarily research on the community. So again, it's going to depend on what the community already has done. Some communities have entire books written on them. Some communities have no history. So it's really going to depend on what your individual history or your individual community already has done in terms of time and effort.
All right, excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Amy, if you're ready to get started on your portion of the presentation, I know you can unmute yourself. Awesome. All right.
All right. Well, I'm Amy Arnold. I'm the Preservation Planner with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I assist communities in establishing local historic districts. So what I'm doing here is basically just a public service announcement about a change in procedure related to survey and local historic districts. So you can do the next slide. Those that are involved with doing a local historic district know that Public Act 169 of 1970 is the Michigan's Local Historic District Act, and it sets forth the procedure for establishing a local historic district. The city has to appoint a study committee to do a survey and to write a preliminary historic district report. So those are the two deliverables that the law already requires a study committee to do. You can go to the next slide. The problem is the law only requires that study committees send the State Historic Preservation Office the study committee report. They don't have to send us the survey. That's been a problem for us because most of the information that we use for our programs would come from a survey report. And we've asked communities in the past to send those, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But in 2018, we got this idea that we need to come into the 21st century, in part because SHPO was developing an electronic data collection system, and we really need the survey data to create the statewide inventory that the National Park Service wants us to have in the first place, and that can be used by consultants, researchers, and everyone when researching Michigan's history. So we need to get the survey report. And to do that, what we did was establish rules in 2018 that say the study committee needs to send us the survey report as well as the study committee report. So it was just bringing our stuff up into the 21st century. You can go to the next slide. We're not changing anything work-wise. The law already required you study committees to do both reports. The difference is that what we want to do this time is to be more involved with the survey report at the beginning so that we know the information is going to be good and accurate. And we're also going to require that you get SHPO approval for the survey report, which means that we'll look at your eligibility determinations and the context to make sure that it really is a report that can be used in the future. So you still have to send in this. Now you're going to have to send us the survey report first and get SHPO approval that all the information in there is acceptable for the requirement of an intensive level survey, which is what you have to do for a study committee report in the first place. Then the other report, the study committee report, is required by law. So we still, nothing's changed about that. The procedure is the same. We're looking at it as an executive summary sort of the survey report. So you don't have to do a whole lot of new information. It's just do an analysis of the raw data that you collected through the survey. The study committee report would probably be about a 10 to 15 page maximum report that has all the items that the law requires: the charge of the committee, the membership, the historic district name boundaries, all that stuff that's listed there. And then it would still have to be transmitted to the review board, the State Historic Preservation Review Board, the SHPO, your local planning body, and the Michigan Historical Commission for comments. And basically their kind of comments are going to be, if they know anything about the history, that will improve the report that way. And you would include samples of individual resources, but more of an analysis to say, like, we have 16 Italianates, 5 of them are brick or something like that, than just a simple context. So we would hope to see a little more analysis there. And then it's the study committee report that starts the clock for the whole review process for local historic districts. So after you send us the study committee report, then you do the public hearing, and you have 1 year to complete the report. So nothing has changed with that. It's still a requirement that you do that. We're not asking for any more work. The only real change is that we're asking for the survey report to come to the SHPO for approval, and the final report to be sent to the SHPO so that we can then integrate the data that's been collected through the survey report into our electronic data collection system in the future. I think it'll just be a lot better that way to have the information that's handy and helpful for decisions. And that's pretty much all I have.
All right, Amy, a quick question came in that I think we can pause for since since we're in this process of that update. So the question is, so do submit survey report first for local historic district or National Register historic district as well? Is it just for the local or for National Register as well?
This is for local historic districts.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for that clarification.
Mallory, at this point, we are recommending that a survey be done before a National Register nomination be done, but it's not a requirement. It's the way that it's supposed to happen, but it's not a requirement at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are also joined by Jennifer Reinhardt of the City of Detroit. She is one of their historic preservation planners who works with designation. And so we're going to turn this over to her.
Hi, everyone. As Mallory mentioned, my name is Jennifer Reinhardt. I'm a historic preservation planner with the City of Detroit. And I did want to take a moment to thank MHPN for inviting me to be part of this webinar and for the great work that they do for the City of Detroit and also all throughout the state. I'm going to bring up my slides. There we go. All right. So I wanted to take a few moments to talk about a recent ongoing survey that we're currently working on in the Cass Corridor area of Detroit. And this is a CLG funded grant. So I would encourage whoever's participating to definitely use that as a resource. It's a great resource. We are actually using that as kind of a hybrid model. We are hiring a consultant to do a survey of areas that have not previously been listed. You can see on the map diagram over here of the survey area, we have numerous properties and resources that are currently local historics or or listed on the National Register. And so our local staff is going to be responsible for going out and, for all intents and purposes, resurveying those areas. But we are looking holistically at the area, as Katie mentioned earlier, to develop that full historic context. And I think that the importance for us is that, you know, while these have been surveyed in the past and resulted in many listings, oftentimes the data is 20 years, maybe 40 years out of date. And so it's important for us to go out and resurvey this area for, to update our records. And I'll go into a lot of the other rationale and also our approach for this project. This project came to our attention for a lot of reasons. The area is currently experiencing rapid growth in the city. There's a lot of resurgence in the Midtown neighborhood, but then there's also a lot of larger development projects and plans there's an arena district and a new stadium that's impacting the study area, as well as Wayne State University expanding and going through their master plan for the last couple of years. So looking at that, and then also being approached by members of the community that were both concerned and also looking for more information about historic resources in this area. And so they reached out to our city council. And so we, as an office, were asked to look at this area in more detail to address these concerns and have community engagement to talk through the process as a local government of potential designation, but also the importance of surveying in communities. And so, as I mentioned before, one of our big goals is just to update our records and account for the changes that have happened in the area since the area was last surveyed. And so you can see, and unfortunately in some cases, we have experienced demolition of historic properties. Some of them, like the one pictured here, which is for Cass Tech High School, that's still currently listed on the National Register. So we're going through and cataloging and keeping track of these properties to then pursue delisting if necessary. We can also see there's been a lot of changes with infill construction that's happening in these districts that's affecting the district. And so to account for both these new structures, but then also look at the impact that these new buildings are having on the historic fabric of that community or of that area. We also have many great examples of rehabilitation. So properties that described in previous surveys now have been rehabilitated. And so we want to update our inventory to account for that. And we also do indeed have an example of relocation of a property. This is the Mackenzie House that has been, still not in the ground, but it has been moved almost an entire block away. And so we want to include that in our survey and how we are describing these places. I did want to talk about, Katie mentioned earlier, Detroit has also in recent CLG grants, and also working with the SHPO for their civil rights citywide survey, we wanted to be sure to integrate new information that's come across in those efforts into the Cass Corridor. So just briefly, this one example on the left is the Bellcrest apartment, and that came out in the Civil Rights Survey that it had significance or incident that happened there that's not currently mentioned in the materials. So integrating that information when we're going out in the field, as well as for apartment buildings, that was a citywide survey that really developed the context statement, talking about apartment building form, function, and it came out that this building in particular was a really good, it showcased the social history of owners and builders and investors who owned the buildings, lived in the buildings, and invested in that, and also several nearby that's very particular to the development of the Cass Corridor, and also early 20th century development and investors in the city of Detroit. So we want to incorporate that information in our data as well. It was also a really big focus for us is going to be expanding areas of significance and looking particularly at ethnic heritage. We know that the Cass Corridor in the 40s and 50s was one of the primary locations for migrants coming from the south to settle. And so this photo shows actually one of the apartment buildings in the Cass Corridor. So we want to develop that further to tell that more complete history, as well as the Cass Corridor was the location of Detroit's second Chinatown in the 1960s, after the first Chinatown in downtown Detroit was condemned and razed to build the Lodge Freeway. And so we want to look at patterns of migration, we want to look at ethnic heritage, cultural heritage in the Cass Corridor to tell a more complete story of the people as well as the places in our survey and in our final report. Along that line, we also did want to focus on the counterculture movement that the Cass Corridor is known for in connection with Wayne State University, but also beyond that with artists, music, musicians, poets. There's a lot of of important history there. And this building here is included in the Willis Selden district, but it doesn't talk about it specifically its importance as the Willis Art Gallery and as the hub, or one of the hubs for this creative movement, the Cass Corridor art movement. And so we do want to spend some time developing that. And I also wanted to bring up Dali in the Alley, which has been a yearly occurrence in Detroit since 1977. So when we think about intangible cultural heritage and how people are experiencing these places for over 40 years, and it's really an integral part of how the community defines itself. We want to find ways in our survey to talk about this. And one of the, I'll just quickly give an example. One of the garages in the Dali in the Alley was part of the historic house of one of the Dodge brothers. And so we've accounted for that history, but now we want to expand that to talk more broadly about the cultural significance of these places. So those are a few of our goals and our approach. Oh, yes, and of course, we want to go back and look at architecture, especially styles that weren't included. So for example, the East Ferry Historic District on the National Register for Historic Places excludes a couple buildings as modern. At the time of survey, it wasn't, as Katie mentioned, we're looking at 40 years. So a lot of these properties maybe now have achieved, or we're now recognizing the different styles and the significance they've achieved. And so we want to, when we're out in the field, whether it's for existing districts, reevaluating significance, or in determining and recommending new potential eligible districts for designation, that's also an important criteria that we are looking at, is this more modern architecture and describing it and including it in our historic resource survey. And so I'll end with just a quick, why this is so important for our work. We are really trying as a city to be more proactive about going out in communities and neighborhoods and accounting for resources, whether that's resurveying many of Detroit's older districts or going into areas that maybe have never been surveyed before. We're doing an effort in Detroit's northwest side that was one of the earliest African-American neighborhoods that has not been surveyed before. And so it's really important that we do document those resources as well. And then also, as I mentioned before, provide information to community members, and whether they be, individuals of interest or nonprofit groups or developers or just anyone interested in learning more about these places and how to integrate with preservation planning for neighborhood strategies. We want to make sure that we share this data and it's accessible and useful in that regard. Of course, we want to increase the collaboration between city agencies. So whether it's our Historic District Commission having more up-to-date information, but also sharing that with the planning department or the land bank or other entities that are active in this area, so everyone has a baseline of the historic resources, and then that can help guide decisions. Section 106 is part of that, but then also more city-driven initiatives, or even for council members or other people who are meeting with developers, just to have, it's really important to have accurate and up-to-date information to share. Also, as Katie mentioned, a good byproduct of these surveys are to have the information ready and in a format that could help people if they want to move forward and list resources on the National Register to qualify for either historic tax credits or pursue grant funding. We want to help get it to a point that these resources in the Cass Corridor and all throughout the city are in a place that can really benefit and continue, so we see more of these rehabbed areas and hopefully less of, of demolitions and a loss of this history and cultural fabric. So while these surveys are not going to directly result in any official listings, we will at least have done a lot of the bulk of the work in getting things ready to recommend for that next step, whether it's as what happened in many of Detroit's previous surveys, it resulted in numerous nominations or historic districts. We want to do the same thing for the Cass Corridor and also other areas that we survey. So I think that was my quick run through of why we think surveys are so important, how we're looking at going out in the field and doing our surveys and getting ready, collaborating with the SHPO for moving forward, hopefully doing more proactive strategic surveys in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. We wanted to bring in a community who is actively doing historic resource surveys to share some of their experiences. And Detroit is very fortunate to have staff who can focus on these initiatives. I would add, another goal and benefit of the historic resource survey work that you all are interested in pursuing is you don't know what history you have until you go looking for it, right? And so it can be a really good community builder as well. Over time, sometimes stories get forgotten, right? If it's not something that is spoken about, we can't remember all of the history at all of the time. So historic resource surveys are a really great tool for communities who want to explore what is still there in the built environment, and then using those to look forward. So thanks, Jennifer, for sharing what Detroit is currently working on. I am going to stop your screen sharing so we're all a little bit bigger. So we have some questions that have come in. Please type in more questions. We're planning on being here until 2:30, so we have about 18 minutes for Q&A. Katie, I saw that you wanted to answer a question live, so I'll turn that over to you.
Really, I hit the wrong button. I was going to type it, but that's okay. Christopher asked what CLG stands for. Mallory answered it in the chat, but it's Certified Local Government. It's a program through the National Park Service and our office that allows communities to participate, and there are grant funds available for certified local government communities. We're required to pass through a certain percentage of our federal allocation that we get every year to those communities to do survey projects, nomination projects, physical work projects. So there's a variety of different, we have 32, I think now, because there's 2 new ones.
Right,
so,
right.
In Michigan.
And in the chat, I also said that we did a webinar with Alan Higgins, who oversees the Certified Local Government Program, and that is on our YouTube channel, and I will make sure that I include that in the follow-up email. So if you're interested in learning more about what a certified local government is, what the benefits are, what that program looks like for your community, check that out, and that will be a good starting point. Jennifer, we did have a question come in about how large is your direct staff conducting the Cass district survey? So how many people do you have working on this?
Well, we have me and then Janice Chapman, who is kind of more of a reviewer role. I'm more of the in the field role. And then we did get a summer intern to help us with some photography. So I would say, and then we also have another staff who's kind of on call to assist as needed. So maybe combining all of that, maybe 2 full city positions or maybe, because I'm not working on this full time. So I don't know how to answer that question. We have a lot of people involved but it's not it's not the only thing that we're working on.
Right. So I guess a follow-up question that I have, how long do you guys usually plan out some of these resurvey projects? Like how many months do you budget for it? Does that depend on how many other projects you
Sure.
currently also are working
Yeah,
on?
well, and it
You're in a
also is
unique
dependent
position.
on the grant timeline. So these
Mm.
CLG grants are only 1 year long. And so typically when we put together the application, even before we get the grant, we've really, we've developed that timeline month by month, week by week. And we also have, a number of these surveys under our belt. So I think, a bulk of that preparation is, before the grant gets started. So maybe a month or so of really planning out the project, how it's going to look, before we get the consultant onboarded and actually go out and do field work. But it follows the general structure that Katie mentioned of the research and the photography, the field work, and then the writing of the final or the many drafts of the report, as well as community engagement meetings at the front end, letting people know that this project is happening. And then, we are the entity, we work through council, so we're out in the community a lot. We have a lot of relationships with community groups. So finding ways throughout the survey process, working with the consultant, but also with our office and the SHPO and the community to keep everyone informed and get information. As you mentioned earlier, Mallory, some things, we don't know what we don't know sometimes, but people who live, in these areas are really experts in community history. So we try to give as many opportunities for feedback and guidance as possible.
And I would say part of it depends on, like, if a community is hiring a consultant, it probably depends a little bit on the consultant's capacity at that particular moment. We've had communities that have hired a consultant and had their survey done in less than a month or two. It also depends a little bit on the size of the survey area. Like the Cass Corridor survey that Jennifer's doing is a massive survey.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Kalamazoo example that I used earlier. I think they're planning on about 5 years to do the whole city. I think that's what the plan is, if I remember correctly.
I think so.
But then there's other communities that we work with that are doing the surveys on their own. For example, we've been working with Clarkston for a while on their survey. And I would say they've been working on it for probably 6 or 7 months, and I think they're getting fairly close. And then same thing with Ludington and some others that either are working towards it on their own or with the help of a consultant. And so generally, it's probably about a year is a fairly accurate time frame, but they can take longer. And like Jennifer said, the grant timelines really impact that. Like a lot of our projects end up being 2 or 3 years long because they're much bigger.
Right. And shameless plug for our next webinar on the 20th is planning how to plan and execute these surveys. So if you're feeling very overwhelmed, there's so much to be processing and thinking about, how do I compile this into something that has actionable steps that we can really get a volunteer effort for. If you are in that position where you can't hire a consultant, we will be talking about that on the 20th. So please register and join us, or check out the recording when it's convenient for you. There is another question.
Tackle. Janet's got 3 of them in there right now.
Right. I was going to go for the middle one first. So as we work towards recognizing culturally significant properties of importance to underrepresented populations, the 4 National Register selection criteria do not always apply, or the expected levels of physical integrity aren't met. How are we working within the current guidelines but still accommodating change? And then the follow-up, is there some National Register guidance being developed?
Sure. So you're right, Janet. The National Park Service as a whole, and the preservation field as a whole, has determined that these National Register criteria don't always meet. They don't always encapsulate everything that holds significance to a particular community. And so there may not be as much change or like additional guidance that as some people would like, but they are working on some guidance, where they already have guidance done in terms of civil rights sites. The Detroit Civil Rights Survey that we did Amy can maybe talk a little more about this, but they've established some guidance for how to evaluate those sites when they may not have the integrity, but the significance is such that that they've decided to concentrate on that. So Amy, I don't know if you want to talk any more about the guidelines that they've put out in terms of the civil rights.
What they developed was a context to help people understand the 70-year history of the civil rights movement. But I think Katie was right in saying that you can't always look at things architecturally. When you're looking at civil rights sites, you tend to look at the social history and the significance of what that had to the movement. So they're not always in equal balance. So you have to see, why was the place significant? Like Vaughn's bookstore in Detroit, I think is a good example. It's, it was burned. It has a lot of physical issues, but the social history of it being a center for the Black Power movement and everything is so much more important than just what the building looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to quickly add, I agree with everything Katie and Amy said, and that, is our approach as well. But in Detroit, we have a lot of resources that aren't there anymore. And so to account for that history, we're really looking at incorporating that in the historic context. And like Katie said, we'll probably sprinkle some historic photos because we're talking about, the area as a whole at large. And so we even though they're not still standing, they still have impact and importance. And so we won't catalog them in that way, but we will definitely still include mention of them in the entire or the survey report.
Yep, absolutely. That's one of the downsides of reconnaissance only survey. So the ultimate goal should always be intensive level survey, because if you don't do intensive level survey, you're never going to get to understanding the broader history of that particular building. And if you're only looking at the architectural significance, you're going to miss it. And so that's one of the reasons that in general, reconnaissance level survey is kind of the first step to figure out, like, okay, well, where should we go next, maybe, and the ultimate goal should be intensive level survey, because otherwise you're going to miss. We would have never figured out the Vaughn's bookstore case in Detroit if we hadn't done some intensive level research. And then also, same thing that Jen just said, when you're dealing with these kinds of stories, when the literal destruction of these buildings is part of the story, you have to talk about them, even though they're not there. And we're all about the preservation and the built environment. Those are still a really important part of the story, and you can't exclude those just because they're not there anymore. So.
All right. So we also, all of the work that goes into the survey, it is a labor of love. It is a little labor intensive to go out, take those photographs. When you're doing the intensive level surveys, taking the time to go to community members to get that oral history, and pairing that with what physical research searches in your local libraries or historical societies. And that is all useful information, right? And the more information that you're gathering, the better off that you're making your point to the community that it has resources worth saving. So even though, the forms ask you to distill a lot of that information down into, specific things to share with the SHPO, do you have do you recommend that communities still compile all that extra research that doesn't necessarily go in the form so that they can refer back to?
Yeah, they certainly can. The survey forms, the second page that I didn't show, just for time, we'll look at it next week or in 2 weeks. But the second page is a expandable narrative box that talks about that you can add as much history as you want. Some of them that I get are 25 pages long for one building. And that doesn't bother me. It may bother other people in our office, but I really want these to be useful for whoever's going to be looking at them. And I don't like to look at things without photographs in them, and be able to like illustrate the points that we're talking about or reading about in these. I want to see what it looked like in 1890. I want to see the map of the neighborhood. It helps me figure out what's going on and what it looked like, and it helps build a picture in my head. So I like that when folks do that, because I also think it makes it more accessible. We don't want this to be an academic exercise. We want this to be useful for your community.
Yeah.
So.
I'll just add to that, especially for older districts in Detroit that were established in the 70s or the 80s, where there's a lot of great information, but oftentimes not every building is described in that document. And so I think especially in those cases, it's really important. We're kind of surprised by the amount of original research that our office is doing on some of these buildings that we know are significant. They're part of, let's say, the West Canfield Historic District in Detroit, but a lot more information can be included. And so I think in having individual forms that is a one-stop shop where that will have all of the information at your fingertips that you can search for is a really important resource to have moving forward.
Yeah, and like you said, the more information we have, the better off we are. The difference between a survey report and the National Register nomination, if you go that step, is that the National Register nominations are kind of a distilled down version of the survey report. So it's supposed to be, the survey report should be the big up here, and then there's pieces under that, and the National Register nomination should be a piece of that under that builds. It takes information from the survey report and distills it down into a very, because those are a planning document too. So just trying to, it's a tricky balance as well, because I certainly don't necessarily want to have to like page through page after page after page of deeds research. But if it's presented in a way that is useful for the community, and they tell me that this is important for this property owner to know, it doesn't bother me. It's not going to hurt anything to have more information in these reports, other than it'll make them longer. But
my only caution is that if people put, sort of urban myths about a building or something in there, they need to be sure that they can document something.
Yeah.
A lot of stories get told that aren't true, and then we don't want to keep perpetuating something that isn't documented. So that's kind of a key.
Yeah, that's a tricky balancing act as well too. But yes, Amy makes a good point.
Excellent. Well, we're at 2:28, so we're going to wrap everything up. Is there any closing comments that you guys would like to make before we end?
No, just happy to help in any way that I can. Let me know. Email's the best way to get us right now, because like I said, we're all working remotely. So.
Excellent. Jennifer?
Just that I would encourage communities to look at the CLG grant as an excellent opportunity to fund this work, and then also thinking about internally, maybe coming up with those strategic areas, or how to start layering surveys. So building upon, like I mentioned earlier, we had a citywide apartment building, because that was flagged as an area to look at, or the civil rights survey. And so, and from there, as was mentioned, Bond's bookstore came up. And so like, we're really learning so much. And so I would just encourage communities to think holistically about how, like how this survey could be the most impactful.
Amy, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to again caution people that, there is going to be a change, and we're really not asking any more work. It's just for local historic districts, you should get the survey report approved, and it might take a little more planning at the beginning of your project. So.
All right. Excellent. Well, I will just close out by, again, thanking everyone for their time. And thank you so much for our panelists, Jennifer, Katie, and Amy, for joining us today, and for all of our attendees. And a shameless plug for our next webinar on the 20th. If you want to engage with how to plan out a survey so that it is successful and we can help communities start engaging in historic resource surveys. And then in September, we are working on a webinar, and registration will be open soon, that will go through architectural terminology that is helpful to know when you're going out and starting to describe some of these properties, and where you can find information to help with that research, so you're not just wading into, you know, the ocean without your life raft with you. So hopefully those two webinars will help prepare you even further to engage in historic resource surveys. Again, visit our website at www.mhpn.org. That's where all of our registration is. Our conference is virtual this year, September 21st through 22nd. We're going to have a lot of really great sessions that will be engaging for all who participate. That is open as well. You can find more information at our website. And if you want to become a member to help support this educational programming, we'd love to have you. So thank you all, and have a great day, and we'll see you at our next webinar.